Hello and welcome back. In this lecture I want to talk about constant strings. We know that string literals or a string constant is inside double quotes, but what about the variable itself? How can you make sure that the variable can never change that value? This is referred to as a constant. So a constant string is sometimes necessary in your program where you do not want your values of your variables to ever change. So for example, if we were creating a circumference of some calculation, we would do 3.14159 times diameter. 3.14159 is a constant. It never changes. It represents pi. So it would be really nice if instead of using that magic number, we could use a variable and make sure that that variable never changes. So there are good reasons to use a symbolic constant instead of just typing in the number every time. First off, a name tells you a lot more than a number does. Ode equals 0.015 times house value is much less meaningful than ode equals tax rate times house value. So we want to have variable names that represent numbers that never change. If you read through a long program, the meaning of the second version is a lot plainer. It's a lot easier to look at that code and understand that 0.015 represents the tax rate. Suppose you have used a constant in several places and it becomes necessary to change its value. You would have to go and change that value everywhere in the program, as opposed to just changing it in one spot where you define that constant. I talked about this earlier when I used the term magic numbers. That's what this is referred to. Whenever you see a number used in a program, it's not stored in a variable, it's usually best to create that number and put it in a constant. Because then, if you use it multiple times, and that changes, that variable changes, all you have to do is change it once. You don't have to change it everywhere you use it. So avoid magic numbers, use constants. One way you can define a constant in C is you can use the define preprocessor directive. So this preprocessor directive lets you define constants, and I actually used it in a couple programs. I'm now trying to help explain it. So if you wanted to do a tax rate and it was a constant, you could say define with the pound sign before it. We know it's a preprocessor directive because of the pound sign. And then we would say the name and then the value. When your program is compiled, the value 0.015 is going to be substituted everywhere you have used tax rate. Just like a variable, but it's actually not a variable. You cannot assign any other values to that. If it was a variable, you'd be able to assign data to it. But not in this case because it's a preprocessor. So the preprocessor directive says you can't assign data, and you specify that with the define. So notice the syntax for this. You have the pound symbol followed by define keyword, and then after that you have your name. We're not using any assignment operators. We just have our name and then a space and then the value. So to assign a value to that define, all you need is a space. There's no semicolon at the end. It's not a statement. It's very specific. So what's happening here is there are compile time substitution happening for these preprocessors. The preprocessor runs before the compiler, remember, right? The preprocessor is going to run and it's going to see these define keywords, and then everywhere it sees a tax rate, it's just going to put in 0.015 for the compiler. Define statements can appear anywhere in the program. There's no such thing as a local define. Once you have a define, anybody can use it. Now, best practice or convention is usually to put the define statements at the beginning of the program or inside a include file if you want to share it in more than one source file, but you don't have to do that. Because it's running at the preprocessor, it doesn't have any scope. It doesn't have any local or global. You can just put it anywhere, and anywhere in the program you can see it, even if it's being used before it's defined. Define statements are also really good because they help make your programs more portable. Sometimes you can use a define statement and relate it to a particular computer you're running on when the program is running, and it will get that right value. The define statement can also be used for characters and string constants, not just for numbers. So if we wanted to do something like this, perfectly valid. You just enclose the single characters inside a single quote, and if you want to actually put in an entire string, literal, you just put it in double quotes. And that's what this oops is doing. Another way you can create constants in C is a more recent mechanism. C90 added basically another way, which is providing the constant modifier. You can use the constant keyword to convert a declaration for a variable into a declaration for a constant. And this will allow you never to be able to change that variable. So all you do is you say const, and then the name, the data type, and then the name of the variable. And what this does in this example, it's going to now make months a symbolic constant for 12. We're not calling it a variable because a variable can change, right? That's why it's called variable. You have constants or variables. And constant in months is not a variable, it does not change. Constant makes months into a read-only value. You can display months and use it in calculations. You cannot alter the value of months. Right? And so constants are important if you do not want data to change, and also they can replace magic numbers. Const is a newer approach and is more flexible than using define. It lets you declare a type. It's also has better control over which parts of a program can use the constant. So you should be using constant whenever you can, but you'll see a lot of programs using defined because it was the first mechanism. Also, there's a third way you can create a constant, and that's using the enum. Remember we talked about enums. Enums are a way to create your own type of variable and only have certain data associated with it. You can't change the value of enums, right? Once you define an enum, it has to have those values. It can have different values, but it still is sort of a way to create a symbolic constant. Not a complete way, but a sort of a way. Also with const, you can initialize a character array and declare it as a constant. That's a good way of handling standard messages. So if you say const char message equals the end of the world is nigh, that will declare the message as a constant, and it's protected from ever being modified explicitly within your program. Any attempt to try to modify a message by doing a stir copy will result in an error message from the compiler. And now you can use this for a standard message that may be displayed as output in various parts of the program. The technique for defining standard messages is particularly useful if they are used in many places, like I mentioned. Prevents accidental modification of such constants in other parts of the program, just like magic numbers. So constants, you want to use them in your program. Two ways to employ them, essentially, using the define and using the constant keyword. Please pay attention to this. You might see it in some upcoming examples. Thank you.